this topic is from decoupling to de-risk. Actually, let's go back a little bit. The concept of Chimerica, we know very well. Neil Ferguson first to tell about this word. It means that U.S. China is really, economic integration is becoming so well. But this time is long gone. It's a thing of the past. But then with the pandemic, we have this decoupling. Everyone's talking about decoupling. But as things going on, United States gradually recognize decoupling is not right either, because China and the United States is integrated so much, cannot cut altogether. So since last May, the strategy to U.S. foreign policy towards China is becoming from decoupling to de-risk. So now we have the president. In the May, we have Secretary of State Blinken and Janet Yellen. They all visit China. Then last November, we have President Xi and President Biden. So they meet in San Francisco, and then some good things follow up because last week the third work group meeting between the financial work group concluded in Beijing, also with a commitment to the future cooperation. So my question, Amy, today we are very fortunate to talk about this, with our very distinguished speakers. Let me introduce Amy Celico, from Albright Stonehenge Group. Thank you for coming. And Ida Liu, head of Cities Private Bank. Thank you. And Fei Min, from a partner from Ernst Young in China desk. And Charlie West from Rudy Group. Welcome.
Thank you.
So Amy, do you feel the tension between these two countries are easy?
Well, it's great to be with you, and
Yes.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be with all of you tonight. I live in Washington, D.C., so the temperature is running pretty high there.
Yes.
So it's all relative, I suppose. As you suggested, absolutely, 2023 was a difficult year for the bilateral relationship. Sure. But by the end of the year, in great part aided by knowing that we were going to have this summit between President Xi and President Biden in San Francisco in November, the two governments made it a priority to restart communication and actually start to have a forward-looking agenda to manage a competitive and rather contentious relationship. And so, yes, in the first month of 2024, we've seen ample evidence that the U.S. and Chinese governments are committed to continuing to try to manage the relationship. And I say manage rather than improve or stabilize, because I think we all have known for quite some time that 2024 was going to be a difficult year for the bilateral relationship. And so I find it quite encouraging, again, sitting in Washington, D.C., where you can get discouraged pretty quickly, that the two sides are quite committed to trying to walk this tightrope of obviously, focusing on national security interests, on domestic concerns, on domestic politics as well, but also in that trying to find a way forward. And so just this past week, in addition to, as you mentioned, the financial working group happening in Beijing, in Washington, D.C., the Chinese Minister of Agriculture and Rural Affairs was talking to the USDA secretary, his counterpart, about agriculture cooperation. And then the commercial issues working group between the U.S. Department of Commerce and Ministry of Commerce are talking about their next working group. So there are a whole host of ways where we, yes, are absolutely seeing the two sides trying to manage a contentious relationship, a competitive relationship, but one that is so critically important, not just to our two countries, but to the world.
Of course, but at least this is a good sign, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Ella, you are executive in a global bank. So did you see the tension of the geopolitical tension affect your business?
So first, Firstly, I want to say thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here at China Institute. George, having heard your overview of all the different programs, I will be here for the Tai Chi and the culinary experience. So very excited about that. So obviously, we at the Citi Private Bank are the most global private bank in the world. We operate in 20 countries, 52 cities around the world, and we have a long-standing history in Asia. In fact, over half of our existence, we've been deeply on the ground in China, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. That's 120 years plus of experience in the region. So what we've seen is a very interesting dynamic that's happened over these last decade. So firstly, we started off with this enormous opportunity where China drove the mass amount of returns in our clients' portfolios. And over the last couple of years, the reverse has happened. We're off 40% of the highs in China today. But from a long-term investment perspective, you cannot ignore the #2 largest economy in the world. So despite the challenges that we're seeing between US and China and the bifurcation between the two, there is still an enormous amount of innovation that is happening in China. Let us not forget that US and China drive 70% of the R&D spend in AI. So AI is going to be one of the largest growth opportunities here. It's growing at an accelerated pace. And again, who are going to be the two beneficiaries of that? China and the US. Okay, aside from that perspective as well, yes, China did deliver a GDP of above 5%, 5.2% to be precise this last year. That's up a couple hundred basis points from the prior year. But there's still questions that remain. So investors around the world, the first question they ask me is, what's going to happen with U.S. China? The second question they ask me is what's going to happen with U.S. China and Taiwan. And so those are the types of geopolitical conversations that are happening more so today than they did 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. So you're absolutely right. It went from globalization to deglobalization to de-risking. And today, that is front and center, and I think it's very prudent for investors to understand how to navigate around the geopolitical considerations, which are a big part of how we're discussing positioning on behalf of our clients.
Yeah, great. So, let me ask you, for EY, what does de-risk mean? How does this mean for U.S. business in China?
For EY, first of all, we're a global firm, and our foremost mission is to serve our clients globally. And I think from that perspective, if I go back in history, actually in 2017, our firm CEO actually put a mission in our hands. There's a few of us. He was thinking about between U.S. and China, how that trend will impact our business globally. And this small team, actually now today, we actually publish a quarterly geopolitical observation paper. I'm glad to share. Anyone, if you want to subscribe. But overall, we stay grounded saying, no, we are committed to serve our global clients. And that's where our value is. So, we cannot deny the challenges we're facing, but the most important thing we have right now is to anchor even firmer than before on our value proposition. And for that sake, as Ella was pointing out, AI is the biggest trend. EY, as one of the global firms, we really focus on innovation, and we spend a tremendous amount of budget on AI-related service offerings. And we're actually, for that reason, looking at all global resources, not just US, not just China, India, everywhere. We try to work together and develop service offerings for our clients. So going back to this trend, deglobalization, de-risking, I think our firm stay tuned to all these aspects and try to commit to what we believe we should deliver to our clients. That's what we believe is the most important thing.
Yeah. So from decoupling to de-risking, it seems globalization, tends to slow globalization. Even we're talking about de-risking, the U.S. and China bilateral trade still decreased 15.4%. So, Charlie, do you think the de-risk trend will continue?
Yes. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be with this distinguished panel. So, just to start off, Rhodium Group is an independent research and advisory firm. We're based here in New York. We're a small company, 35 people, who full-time look at what's going on in the Chinese economy and help businesses who are wanting an independent perspective on what's going on in the Chinese economy and U.S. China relations to help give them that perspective. And indeed, all of our clients are coming to us with questions about, okay, what is the future of the U.S. China relationship, the economic relationship? How are geopolitical concerns affecting my future in China, and what will be possible a year from now, what won't be? And what we're seeing in the trade data is, there's these big questions about diversification. How much is this diversification push on the part of the U.S. and EU and Japan driving this diversification trend? And there's really sort of two things going on there. First is that, yes, diversification is absolutely happening. That if you look at the diversification of trade, the United States does a lot of business with China, and that's gonna be there for a long time, because this deep-rooted manufacturing strength that China has, that the United States and the world can't go without. But at the same time, a lot of this new investment is moving beyond China to Vietnam, to Mexico, Brazil, all over. And companies now who are sort of looking at their geopolitical risks and looking at China growth slowdown risks as well, thinking about, okay, well, if the economy this year didn't grow as strongly as I thought it might, what does that mean for next year's investment? And so those are the sort of things that we're talking to clients about right now.
Yeah, follow up with your talking about the U.S. investment, drive away from China, part of to Mexico, other part of Asia. So the FDI, last year's third quarter, for the first time, FDI has to China has a deficit, $11.8 billion. But when you go deeper to this number, you will find that the number is about retained earning. Retained earning foreign company used to put this retained earning still in China, but by the last year's second quarter, they pulled the retained earning out of China. But that's because the U.S. yield is going so much, the interest rate is going so high. So does this number, tell us that a multinational company not interested? How do we interpret this $11.8 billion deficit?
Well, I have been, so at Albright Stonebridge Group, I co-lead our China practice, and we're helping foreign investors across the economy think about their position in the China market. And I can only say that what we have done for the last 20 years is what we're continuing to do, helping clients solve problems, raise their profile, find a way to think through a China strategy. And so, business has changed. We do a lot more geopolitical risks for our clients in different industries in the economy. We talk a lot about diversification because we also are serving clients in other global markets. And indeed, Mexico, Vietnam, Malaysia are beneficiaries of some of that diversification. But again, the numbers that you cite a statistic that companies aren't plowing their earnings back into China. And I do think the fact that COVID kept us apart for almost 4 years did impact the way C-suites, whether they were in Europe, in the United States, or in other Asian markets, were thinking about China. And so, yes, I do think there's a lot of diversification of priorities. However, China remains a priority for most of those companies, even if it isn't a single priority. It is among the top priorities. So I think we have to be realistic when we talk about risk, when we talk about de-risking as well. That, for some industries, means doubling down in China. For other industries, it means, okay, let's diversify so we don't have vulnerabilities if there's going to be increase in tariffs or investment restrictions or more export controls. The list goes on and on and on, coming from Washington, D.C., Beijing, Brussels, and other global capitals. So I think that statistic can be very misleading if
Yes.
just left on its own, Susan.
Yeah, it's exactly. I know that Citibank is going to launch its wholly owned investment bank in China at the end of this year.
We are,
Yeah.
because as I said, we're very committed to the region, and we've been on the ground there for over half of our existence, 120 years, so we are going to launch our investment banking business there. We continue to have a wealth management private bank business there, and the reality is that, look, I think there is a, how can I say it, almost a bit of a loss of confidence for many of the international investors. Actually, I just came back from Davos, and the Chinese delegation and President Xi had 140 people there at Davos. And at the CEO luncheon where President Xi spoke, he used the word regaining trust 14 times. So there is an awareness that there has to be some restoration of investor sentiment towards China, and that means some reforms and some ways of showing the global community that they're serious about growth, they're supportive of growth, and the like. But again, as I said, we're taking a long-term view, and as I said, China is dominating in some of the biggest and most explosive industries that we are following closely. That includes AI, it includes cyber, it includes robotics, and it also includes the clean energy transition where China dominates in batteries and solar. So there are so many elements of creativity, innovation that are happening within the region. One cannot ignore that as an investor, particularly as a long-term investor. And as I said, AI is the #1 topic that you're going to hear from everybody globally in every discussion, and generative AI. And what's worth noting here, again, is that China does dominate in AI R&D. And if you believe the statistics that AI is going to unlock 18 trillion of efficiencies to our global GDP over the next decade, that means that we could unlock anywhere from a 15 to 20% growth in China's GDP just from this one area. So just to say that we're quite constructive, again, if we can rebuild the trust and restore the investor sentiment and going back into the region.
But just at Davos, Jimmy Dimon from and other executives from Goldman Sachs, they said that the risk is changing dramatically, and growth at all cost is changing. So how does Citi view this?
It's as I said, you have to look at all the pros and cons. We have to see that we're heading in the right direction in terms of encouragement of foreign investing, and again, those policies that are pro-growth, frankly. But for us, we're very committed, as I said, to the region. Most of the clients that we work with are extraordinarily global. Most of their companies are extraordinarily global, and it touches China and other countries around the world, and we see the benefits of that globality. But again, to some of what has already been commented here today, that bifurcation between U.S. and China has created interesting and unique investment opportunities with the changing supply chains. To countries like Mexico nearshoring with the U.S., to Southeast Asia, where a lot of the production from China has gone downstream, and even countries like India, where there's a lot of opportunity from the changing dynamics of the supply chain too. So we're monitoring that very closely for our clients as well.
Yeah, but for EY, I know things will be very difficult because right now Chinese government just, take like the foreign accounting firm will not be as widely used as before. I know EY, SOE count 12% of EY's business in China. So how will EY still keep full commitment in China?
Well, as I said, we're a global firm,
Yeah.
and our global clients need us, will be there. And as my peer speaker was saying that, first of all, I think there's industry sector difference when it comes to commit to China or not, or pause. I wouldn't say that withdraw necessarily. And the other thing that I think we need to look at China's value proposition. Over the last 30 to 40 years, China's contribution to the world has evolved, right? And this evolution, this path of evolution, I think personally was really celebrated by neighboring jurisdictions around China in Asia Pac. Many nations wanted to, I wouldn't say replicate necessarily, but really want to be successful as well. So I think the so-called decoupling, de-risking, or in the last few years, people say, China plus one strategy when it comes to supply chain is a way to lift the whole region. I personally, I lead a China desk, but I work with my APAC peers, and I'm glad to see that they're introducing strategies in India, Vietnam, so on and so forth. It's just interesting that sometimes I see similar policies that I see in China like 20 years ago. Very interesting. But at the same time, as my fellow speaker was saying, that China now is focusing a new value proposition. And I hope everybody's, excited about it, right? I mean, what's the fun of it if it's just one player in the market, right? So going back to your question, yes, we are seeing risks, we're seeing challenges, but we're of course committed still in China. Our people are there, we still have clients there, so I have no doubt in my mind.
Yeah, but last year is very tough year for consulting and accounting firm in China. Deloitte was fined $30.8 million. And China rated the consulting firm Capvision and Mintz whether the industry crackdown. So Charles, how do you interpret this? So is the risk calculation changed, especially for those firms that was affected very seriously?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question about Capvision and Mintz, I mean, each of those cases are different. We don't really understand, I think, fully what the full backstory behind those things are. But I mean, I think the concern that we heard from clients when those cases took place was that we won't necessarily be able to have full confidence that if we're working on a sensitive research project, well, on China's economy, well, what exactly is sensitive? Where is the line drawn? One of the most concerning things for us is that, in recent speeches, just as of a couple months ago, there's been a real emphasis on sort of telling a positive story about the Chinese economy no matter what. And if you're a research firm like ours, whose job is to tell an honest accounting of what's going on in the Chinese economy, that's a little scary, and so that's an element of concern for us. That, and I think that's been well voiced. I think people hopefully are getting the message that, we need to be able to tell a true story for us to be able to do business in China effectively.
Yeah, Amy, I saw a survey conducted by American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Just over half of the 325 members were optimistic about the 5-year business prospects in China, the lowest since 1999. In 2021, the number is 78%. How this number tell the sentiment in business?
Well, I was working in Shanghai in 1999 when that would have started, and so if we go back in time, that was prior to China's accession to the World Trade Organization, and so let's think about these trends through a larger or wider lens. So of course there was massive amounts of optimism about growth potential in the China market from the early 2000s after China acceded to the World Trade Organization, opened up, and the world was very welcoming of China into that and the opportunities for foreign investors. Companies went in. A lot has changed since then. We don't have to go through all of it. But I think what you're hearing from American companies, it's not all foreign companies, it's American companies. And what we have been hearing from them is that U.S. China relations is an impediment to them continuing to have confidence in their 5-year outlook. And so because U.S. China relations continues to draw out differences, result in policies that do inhibit trade and investment flows, and then raise the risk for potential retaliation from one government against the companies of the other country in its markets, it is difficult to be as optimistic as foreign investors once were. And I think as all of us have also said, the state of the Chinese economy, the policy decisions being made in Beijing as well as in Washington, Brussels, other capitals, absolutely impacts the environment for American businesses operating on the ground in China. And so this is the most quote-unquote pro-China group you're going to find, the American business community operating in the market who see the benefits of being in the market. And so we have to take that decrease in confidence seriously, that American companies who are there on the ground feel the pressure, see it then turn into blocks, hurdles for them, many by Beijing, and also from Washington, D.C. as
Do
well.
you feel the pressure is mainly from the prospect of China's economy, or is because the Chinese government's attitude toward economy, toward business?
I think it's a combination of both. I think it's a really interesting question, and I know everybody on this stage will have an opinion on this. I'll just start. I think that companies are seeing the Chinese government and the U.S. government. We can go back in time here. This is not a partisan issue. I'm in Washington. I'm always thinking of politics. It started in the Trump administration and has continued in the Biden administration, more and more restrictions. But if you talk to officials in the Trump administration and the Biden administration, Democrats and Republicans, they say this is in response to Chinese policies. And so have Chinese policies been intimidating and actually putting blockages for American companies because of their nationality in China? Yes, absolutely. And so even bigger than that, and I'll end on this point, the attitude toward business. It is not just American companies being targeted by the government. Chinese private companies, private sector companies, are also feeling less supported than they were in the past, I think over the past 5 years, and that impacts investor confidence, as we've been saying.
Of course, to say about investor confidence, we see last year Chinese stock market is among the worst performance of the year, and in 2023, 75% of the money invested in China out of the China. So Ella, your work is involved with a lot of high net private investors. Do they also want to pull the money out of China's stock market?
So that's a very interesting question, and I would put it in this manner. I think there's several risks that our investors are still contemplating and thinking about. The first is the real estate situation in China. As everybody knows in this room, real estate is the vast majority of the growth in GDP for China. It's about 30%. And we have to have a really strong understanding about the policy and the reforms that are happening there to contain it. There's still something like 75 ghost towns in China that are unoccupied, which is quite alarming in many ways. Okay, I think the second thing that we need to better understand too is the trajectory of the population. It's something that we're just starting to talk about now, but you saw that the population in China came down last year by a couple million and continues to be projecting to go down, which then has broader implications for workforce productivity and the like. And for the first time ever, India surpassed China in terms of population this last year. Okay, so that's a second consideration.
But I have a different opinion on this. Since AI will have this revolutionary force, so many people don't have job in China. Right now, the youth unemployment rate, according to officials, is around 14 or 15, but a lot of people say maybe it's around 40%. So with so many unemployed youth, with less population, it will be better for China's economy in the future.
I'm not sure I agree with that. No, but you're right. There is a very problematic landscape too with the unemployment situation of very, very talented, highly educated individuals.
AI will replace so many jobs,
well,
right?
Not immediately. AI will touch 60% of the jobs, and I think it's going to unlock the potential and the power of our people. It is going to displace in the near term only 5% of the jobs, but let's not forget that AI will also create a lot of jobs. Now, the key there will be the transition of educating the next generation workforce in the right way. And also the other key, very important, is that we, as business leaders, when deploying and utilizing AI and generative AI, that we do so in a very responsible and ethical way, establishing guardrails so that we can continue to protect our clients' data and information and use it to automate systems, to unlock the inefficiencies in the frontline client organization, but nothing more than that at this moment until the regulations can catch up the speed of pace of which is happening in AI. So that I think is very important that we all do that and take responsibility on the way that we're going to deploy AI. But the third thing that I just wanted to mention to you, and this comes up in most of my conversations with the investors globally, is what's going to happen with Taiwan. That is what we call the biggest black swan consideration for investors. But one thing that we all need to remember is that Taiwan produces 90% of the most sophisticated semiconductor chips in the world. It is the only country that has the ability to produce the 0.5 nanomillimeter chips today. And it will take 3 to 5 years for China and for the U.S. to catch up to this technology. So until such time, we have to remember that Taiwan is the brains behind everything that is happening in tech, AI, cyber, all of the innovation, all of it is being driven by semiconductor chips in Taiwan. So my best estimate and our best estimate is until we solve the problem around the dominance of semiconductors that fuel both China and the US and the rest of the world, hopefully nothing will be happening there. Although we just had an election, and I think the response from Beijing has been very muted to the new DPP candidate in Taiwan, and hopefully we'll stay that way.
Oh, Ella, you still did not answer the question. Yeah, is this high net worth private investor, do they also put the money out?
So listen, our clients are long-term investors. They are globally minded investors. They understand the benefits of global diversification. Many of our investors were invested in Asia 10 years ago. And in this last decade, they have benefited a lot from the exponential growth that has happened in the region. Have I seen large flows come out? No. But I also haven't seen more funds being deployed into the region. Why? Because the rest of the world has been performing, namely US, and so the opportunity is greater in the near term as we see it in terms of near-term growth opportunities in private equity, in the US market, and the like. So I would say patient, not necessarily withdrawing, but not adding to the allocation at the moment. It's a wait and see, right? And rebuilding the trust from China.
I mean, you are in charge of U.S. China desk. You know, you're dealing with so many companies doing business in China. So what's their attitude? You know, how do they see the risk in China right now?
From my recent experience, I'll answer your question head on. I think I really like what you said about preserve. I think, you know, China has contributed so much actually to multinational companies' last 10, 20 years growth globally. My clients, I believe, I really, individual level, through conversations, I think they love China because China give them this platform, give them this growth. Now they want to preserve what has been created.
So how do they see the
And they want
investment opportunity there?
And they want to stay nimble. So we're seeing not necessarily putting more chips in, we're not necessarily seeing taking them all out.
Exactly.
But I'm seeing more and more different cooperative arrangements, different contracts, different projects. You may say they're piecemeal, but when they put together, you can see the connection. There's still a strong connection there. They're still going to go forward. So I forgot your question, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I believe the faith is there, and I believe this faith was built on the last 40 years. And I also want to say that I was on a platform about 2 years ago, and that was when the Shanghai lockdown was happening. And there was one speaker saying what if the current China administration didn't really care about the economy anymore? They only care about political correctness. That was a very scary moment. I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? But now, after some pain, 2 years today, we hear President Xi saying, let's regain. I think from that statement, at least you can see that sentiment, that awareness, oh, wait a minute, we cannot, override all these people's, calling, right? So anyway, I'm, as I was telling Charlie, I'm a very optimistic person, so maybe biased, but I'm optimistic.
But they do have some positive sign, recently, although so many money put out of Chinese stock market, some investors buying Chinese bond. Last December, the net flow of money to invest to Chinese bonds, $25 billion, and it's the fourth month of this amount of money. It's mainly invest in Chinese government and a big bank. So what this number tell us, contrast with the stock market? Could you tell us?
I'm not sure, but probably my colleagues here would have a better answer. I mean, I think probably a big part of that is the stock market has performed so poorly, and because of capital controls, some of the options to seek returns, in the United States or elsewhere really aren't available, and so you try to find stable returns where you can. What I think is really interesting about sort of these rebuilding measures is exactly sort of what they look like. It's been our view that confidence rebuilding measures are absolutely necessary. But those measures need to be with an eye towards building a sound, sustainable economic growth that ultimately requires a stronger private sector. And some of the confidence building measures we've seen so far, which is one of the reasons we're a bit skeptical about the numbers we saw last year, was in October there was a $1 trillion emergency sort of issuance of special treasury bonds to sort of prop up the economy through government spending. There's Bloomberg reporting now from just this prior week saying that there's going to be a bailout fund for the stock market to the tune of 2 trillion RMB, most of which is money coming from state-owned enterprises who are moving their money back in because they moved it all overseas when returns were higher elsewhere. And these are really temporary solutions, right? These aren't the sort of measures that we need to see to establish a new growth model for the Chinese economy now that the past decade of property sector investment-led growth has firmly come to an end.
But do you think right now Chinese government is doing enough stimulus to help the economy?
The thing is, I don't think it's a matter of stimulus.
Yeah.
And I also don't think, there's a question of, okay, well, why did it take so long for the government to put all this up? And I think there's a couple of reasons. First off, I think there was a delayed awareness within policymaking circles about how bad it got because official data wasn't published that said that China was on par to hit 5.2% all year, despite the fact that forecasts at the beginning of the year said, yeah, 5.2% on the back of strong consumer demand that never really firmly materialized, off of a recovering property sector which did not materialize. Exports were bad, and so when you're in a system where you can't admit that problems are happening, how do you issue tools then to solve it? So I think that was one of the reasons there was delay to stimulus. And I think there's also fundamentally a limit to sort of what China can do at this point. We have built so much debt after, in infrastructure and the property sector that I don't think there's as much room to the sort of big bang stimulus that we saw in 2008.
Even though China's economy right now had kind of serious situation, but some analysts, like Professor Yasheng Huang, from MIT, he said China's problem is not about economics, it's about politics. Because, as long as China will still focus on economic development, market-oriented reform programs, China should be okay. But nowadays, not only foreign investors, foreign companies, but also people in China, everyone, everyone is wondering, everyone is thinking if the economic paths we went through in the past 40 years will continue. Do you think it will continue?
It's very hard to get a strong sense of that with this leadership. I agree with you. I think there has been a real securitization of economic policy making that in some ways we're now starting to see the United States not emulate, but also fall into that mindset that economic interdependence, globalization, creates vulnerabilities. And so rather than talking about what are the economic policies that can continue to stimulate an economy for the long term, I think in Beijing there has been this reaction of we're vulnerable to levers being pulled by foreign governments because of our interdependence with the world. And so how do we overcome that? We overcome that by talking again about self-sufficiency, ideas that went to the wayside because they didn't make good long-term economic sense. But we hear a lot more of that now from Chinese government leaders. And so you're right, it's a different mindset than some of their modern predecessors. And I'm still waiting to see really a change in attitude. I think within modern Chinese history, we've seen a lot of quick pivots, though. Pragmatism in a system that doesn't have a pesky Congress and four-year election cycle can be much quicker to act in China. And we've seen examples of that in the past. So I guess to quote my great mentor, Madeleine Albright, I too am an optimist who worries a lot. And so I'd like to see some of that change in attitude. To come back to what you said, Susan, what we all know has been, a growth model that has been focused on helping China for the long term. Even though over the past decade, some of the tools just didn't materialize to make a transition. And now with a national security overlay on most policy decisions, that is very difficult unless there's another change of heart.
Yeah, exactly, because actually right now in China, people will say if the private sector can do the same thing as before, can function as same as before, China's economy should be okay, because the past 40 years is not what Chinese government did something to have this economic miracle, is what Chinese government not do, to let the market to function, to let every Chinese can pursue their own dream. That's the reason China be so successful in the past 40 years. So if the same policy can persist, people will have a lot of confidence. So Ella, you mentioned that in Davos, President Xi about trust, talk about trust, and Premier Li Qiang also want to convince foreign company to do business again in China. China is investable. China is open for business. But do you think the business community resonate with this word?
I definitely think there's progress, okay? And in speaking with most of the CEOs, particularly even at Davos, most of them were planning to visit China. And most of them were looking forward to going back into mainland and, going back into the country and, really excited about it, actually. So that gives me hope that we're heading in the right direction, and only time will tell, but I think all the signals are quite positive.
How about you, Min? You grown up in China. I think you understand more about what I say. How do you think about this?
I think there are a couple of things you said. I'm not sure I agree 100%. One about is the growth is, I think you said the growth over the last 40 years is because the government did not interfere. But the GDP growth in China relied on so much on real estate.
Of course.
And we saw the whole ghost towns, which we all know is not a healthy part of the economy, right? So we all know this blister needs to be popped at some time, just depending when, right? And now we're coming to this juncture and it needs to be dealt with. How I felt over the last 40 years of my career, 30 years of my career, I'm just thinking that no one nation's evolution is a straight line. It's impossible. So at some juncture, you come to pause, you have to refigure your strategy, and I think that's where China is. And unfortunately, the political landscape is a huge wild card. Whether or not that's going to create just a dead end, or whether or not we're going to go past it. What I'm glad is that if you listen to the debate in Taiwan before the election, all three candidates basically were saying we're going to be happy if it status quo. No one's pushing for, a particular political agenda. I think I was very happy they all came to the same, even though the elected party did not make a clear announcement, but I think they saw the point. So I hope with that settled, Beijing is not going to react, in an extreme way, right?
Yeah.
So, I agree with Amy that we stay optimistic because we're looking at long-term trajectory, but we do have to stay observant as to the current events. Hopefully, things will go forward, right?
Charlie, I know your company did a lot of research regarding China's economic policy. So how do you think that? Do you think right now the Chinese leaders, President Xi and Premier Li Qiang, what they said earn trust? Do you think can they earn foreign companies' trust?
Absolutely. It just has to be backed by observable, verifiable, effective policies that demonstrate that there's a commitment towards an open, fair playing field for foreign businesses. I think that's what businesses have been asking for the most. And I do think also there does need, and this is where it gets challenging, and all of it's challenging, but managing the security relationship, all of these sort of interesting, fun, big growth technologies, many of them have dual use applications, right? And so coming together and managing the challenges around AI and around all of these different technologies, chips foremost, is going to be a challenge. But if there can be strong signals on both sides that these things can be managed, I think there is absolutely. I too am an optimist. But it will require some strong messages and action, I think, before foreign businesses really buy it.
Great. Yeah, I do think like Chinese economy and foreign investors are really in a very, very critical moment, because it's like either it's you go forward or you stop, you withdraw, because different companies make different decisions. Like Dell used to operate in China for 25 years, but just last year at this time, Dell announced they will stop to buy China-made semiconductor by 2024, and is considering moving half of its production outside China by 2025. And Apple also want to diversify from China, but still, Apple right now have still 2 million workers to work for Apple. So it's very, very difficult. It's very, very complex. So do you think foreign company right now is in a crossroads? What they do now will affect their business in the future?
Well, I do think that companies feel the pressure, and they feel like they are caught sometimes between a rock and a hard place, because in order to comply with the law of the land, either where they're domiciled or where they're headquartered, as a foreign investor and then as a national company, public sector, private sector, they sometimes face contradictions. I mean, the example that you just cited, Susan, I have significant doubts that that is an accurate representation of that company. But what I don't doubt is that company faces pressure from U.S. government, where they sell, of course, to the U.S. government as well as to the private sector, and then, of course, continues to manufacture and sell in the China market. And most companies want to do both. They want to be working in the largest economy in the world and the second largest economy in the world. But increasingly, so many companies in so many different sectors, like we've been hearing about tonight, are facing restrictions around some kind of national security application that is going to inhibit them. And so what I know from every one of my clients is they have to navigate those challenges and those risks and find a way to, in advocacy as well as in passive, investment decisions, try to maintain their presence in these two incredibly important markets. And so a lot of that is about policies. Policies, just today, we know that the White House is talking about putting an executive order out on data. And so that is going to be targeting countries of concern, i.e. China. We also know from the American Chamber of Commerce and many others that China's cross-border data flow policies have been an inhibitor for foreign companies in China, Chinese companies in China too. The Chinese government heard industry complaining about that and is now changing those rules. Will the U.S. government, as they said today, listen to industry and make sure any data rules they put in place are not overly broad and restrictive and inhibiting cross-border trade and investment flows? They say they're going to listen to industry, but that is the role of the business community in talking to governments about the adverse effects of national security related policymaking. Some issues are cut and dry. If there is a dual use for a technology, then you do have to restrict it for national security. But what we're hearing from so many companies is they are calling on governments to remember to keep that yard small and the fence high, in Jake Sullivan's parlance, about restrictions, both in Beijing and Washington.
But do you think
and
in the
others.
future the fence will increase even higher?
I think that's the trend that we're seeing, and so again, it's the role of the business community to say, what are the implications of this? Because we don't want to see decoupling. We know it would be terribly, very difficult to implement, but then terribly damaging for economies around the world. And so how do we maintain this balance of restrictions where national security insists upon it, and we all should, and not seeing that yard get too big as well as the fence high? It's a challenge right now in the politics of Beijing, of Washington, where they are in some ways really over-regulating industry. But again, I'm a firm believer that companies can't be passive in the face of that. We have to share our expertise on what the ramifications of these policies will be.
Yeah, that's a very tough situation. But Ida, do you think in what kind of situation that foreign companies can reinvest China?
In what kind of situations a foreign
Yeah.
company can really invest in
Yeah.
China?
Reinvest, it's
Reinvest.
not, reinvest.
Okay, well, it comes down to two things, trust and security. I mean, you've been hearing that from every single person on the panel today. We need to restore trust and confidence. We need to have the right policy, business-friendly policies in place, and we have to know that our data is not going to be compromised. I think if we can achieve those things, many people will be very open-minded, okay? And that's on top of everything that I totally agree with you, by the way, that delicate balance of that. But, I cannot underscore enough how global our companies are. I cannot underscore enough how global the families are that we serve today. That there is no way to just extract yourself from the second largest economy in the world. Okay, so that is another layer, and to your point, I completely agree that is where companies, businesses, the ultra high net worth family offices and the like have to play a part in sharing those types of views and experiences.
So it's not okay to avoid China? No. But just now, talk about in what kind of situation foreign companies will reinvest. But in what kind of situation that is going so bad that foreign companies don't want to engage with China?
I guess when you look at the importance of China, at least from my experience, there are two things, right? It's not debatable that China's huge market. And then let's not forget, China now also has a very big talent pool that was developed over the last 20, 30 years. In what situation, the multinationals will stop engage? In my lifetime, I don't think that's going to happen. And as to the investment strategy, I see continuing training going on in China, and I see multinational companies, my clients, take the talents they develop in China and mobilize them and leverage that knowledge across the region, and even some of them brought executives in China, in the U.S. in the factory to train. And so I think, like you were saying, the globalization, when it started, we're thinking about supply chain, but now it's in our daily life, all the knowledge, all the transactions. So I honestly, I think for every business, because business nature is to seek prosperity, I don't see how you can exclude China.
So in the end, what kind of relations does foreign enterprise want to have with China?
A profitable one, I think. Yeah, I mean, one where they can see a sort of a long-term future where they can compete fairly and do business and succeed, right? I think that's foundational to any business, no matter where they are, China not least. If I can say one thing maybe about the broader relationship, I just got back from China in November for my first trip in many years, post-COVID and all that. And I visited some friends studying abroad there who run a study abroad program there, and they told me that there are about 400 American undergraduates currently studying abroad in China, which is down from 14,500 when I was there as an undergrad in 2009. And so I know that there are a lot of students here from Pace University, and I want to encourage you to do one thing when you go back to school tomorrow, is to go to the study abroad office, find a person there named Becca Slotkin. She runs the study abroad program there, and go talk to her about studying abroad in China. It's so important that young people reestablish these people-to-people relationships that are fundamentally at the very basic level, like where commercial relations come from, right? And so I strongly encourage you guys to go to China, study there, spend some time there, learn the language. So I'll get off my soapbox.
If I can piggyback on that, there's a organization in China, actually founded by a Harvard graduate American guy. He spent about 10 years in China and founded the U.S China group, and he published a book about the new generation in China, about their consumption style, about how this generation of Chinese had their pause on the future consumption style. Look that up. I think it was a fascinating book to read. And if you do spend time in China, go inland. No, play mahjong. That's how you appreciate the culture.
Yeah, the last question is about election. Yeah, like election is the most difficult thing to, the outcome, is the biggest uncertainty, between U.S. and China relation. So how did you see the outcome of this election affect Sino-U.S. relationship?
I will try my very hardest to be nonpartisan in my answer. I have to say, I do think, we've all been talking about 2024 with the Taiwan election at the beginning of the year, the U.S. election at the end of the year, EU election, smack dab in the middle, is so consequential for so many areas of U.S.-China relations, and all three are, and will continue to be. But I just want to say, a second-term Biden administration or a second-term Trump administration is likely to continue along the same trajectory we've been seeing over the past 6 years. And that is going to be one filled with challenges for U.S.-China relations. So I see neither, us going off a cliff with U.S.-China relations or a steady improvement just based on November. I think it's going to continue to be very, very challenging. I know some say in a second-term Trump administration, things would get much worse. But I think Trump's advisors probably suggested that on the Taiwan issue over the past week, he said he reinforced the idea of strategic ambiguity, not automatically assuming the United States would come to Taiwan's defense in the event of some kind of conflict. And I think he did that in order to maintain, ability to go one way or another. And so this idea that a Trump administration is automatically going to make things worse, I don't think we can say that for sure. Just because there are so many things we don't know about what a second-term Trump administration would be. And I just want to say the same for a second-term Biden administration. You could say, oh, it's just going to be more of the same. But in second terms, when they're in a row, oftentimes the president thinks about their legacy. And maybe President Biden's second-term legacy would be finding that stabilization in the relationship that has been so elusive over the last 6 years. So we really don't know in Washington, D.C. what it's going to mean for U.S. China relations if one of the likely two candidates who are going to be on the ballot in November is reelected.
But someone argued that since Trump is now pro-business, so maybe his second term, maybe it's good for foreign companies doing business in China. The Chinese policy will, in the business term, can be a little bit better.
Yes, you can argue both. You could also say, well, he was the guy who started the trade war, that many of my clients are still feeling the impact of those tariffs, and so that wasn't exactly terribly pro-business. But you're right. He could say, I want to make a deal with the government of China so that we can stabilize the relationship somehow. But I will say, sadly, my optimism aside, I do think the U.S. and China have more than the next year to go in dealing with a pretty contentious relationship. So a second-term Biden administration or a second-term Trump administration is going to be challenging. And that's okay, as long as it doesn't veer into conflict. But I do want to come back to the point you've made repeatedly, and that is that Taiwan really and truly is the most sensitive issue we know for Beijing. And that trajectory is not set. I'm not quite as optimistic as maybe you or Min, just because we saw that DPP won the presidency but lost, of course, the legislature, and so maybe that made Beijing a little less worried. However, what we keep continuing to hear is 4 more years of the DPP, the continued status quo. Beijing sees that eroding the potential in the future. And so they may not be willing to wait. So I just think that is out of the hands of whoever is sitting in the White House next year at this time. These are issues, geopolitical issues, that supersede the U.S.-China relationship, but will be deeply impacted by it.
Is business sector worried about the election?
I think the answer is yes. But I really don't have much more to add than what she's so articulately already said. Anything that we would be saying up here would be pure speculation. So varying degrees of outcomes, let's see what happens, okay? But we're hoping for the best and bracing for the worst.
That's great. Let's give our speaker a round of applause. We're open for questions.
And so I'm wondering, in your opinion or other panelists, does the Chinese government realize how important to the world, and they realize it, and would that perhaps cause them to be a little cautious because an invasion obviously would just disrupt the whole world?
So it's very nuanced what I just said. I said that Taiwan dominates the most sophisticated, smallest 0.5 nanomillimeter chips in the world. That is the exact fuel of everything that's happening in AI, robotics, cyber today. And what I also said is that it's going to take China and the U.S. a few years to catch up to that technology to achieve independence from the reliance so heavily on Taiwan today. So those chips fuel not only the technology innovations around the world, but also the defense systems for China and the U.S. So our humble opinion is that until we can sort out the chip independence, I mean, this is something that is not to be taken lightly.
Yep, does the Chinese government agree with you?
You could jump in.
Yeah, no, so I think there's been a lot of research on this recently that have illuminated the costs, the global costs of the Taiwan scenario. Rhodium has done some work on this, looking at the costs from a blockade of Taiwan that would somewhere in the $3 trillion range, $2 to $3 trillion range. There was another estimate by Bloomberg just a few months ago that under different sort of parameters is closer to $5 trillion. And so I think there's ample evidence that anybody who's sort of watching this will know, including the Chinese government, that aggressive moves that disrupt global trade on that level are undesirable to the global economy, including to China's.
I was wondering if you've mentioned clean energy, and we know China's dominance in these supply chains. Could the panel talk about how you're interpreting China's move to export licensing and some key critical minerals, and particularly the technology? I know there's some arguments that on the technology side and clean energy, it might be a mirroring of the U.S. restricting technology to compete on the semiconductor side. But I'm just interested in your thoughts and how you see the investment sort of in that space. We also at the same time have probably a looming trade war between China and the Europeans over EVs. How are you seeing the kind of clean energy and battery supply chains? Thank you. And thank you for a great discussion.
I'll kick off. I'm happy to turn it over to you. I think that, yes, some of that is mirroring behavior. When you look at Chinese behavior, when I look at Chinese behavior, government behavior, over the past 18 months, it was pretty remarkable to me that the U.S. government continued to put in place pretty significant restrictions. So much so that, the Chinese government is accusing the United States of just trying to put a chokehold on China's technological development. And how have they been responding? They have not taken significant retaliatory action. But I do think they're trying to play to their advantages. And the advantages, as you suggested, are in these industries where they dominate. Whether because of the raw materials are in China, or they've been doing the processing in China, taking from other places, or of course, the innovation that China is driving. And so, of course, on whether it's solar panels or batteries, we could go on and on, electric vehicles next. I think the Chinese government is trying to use these tools in its quiver so that it's not always retaliating against investors in the China market. They need to keep those investors there. And so sometimes they're trying to influence government policies by saying, you're going to put restrictions, we're going to put restrictions on things you need to. And that makes for ripe negotiations between governments to try to see where and how some of those restrictions can be lifted. So maybe it's just creative Chinese policy making.
Agree.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Every time I come here and I learn a lot from the panel. I also want to thank Helen every time you organize such a great panel discussion. I have two questions to ask, and also I have a small comment since I have lived in China and Singapore and the United States. And I think I agree with Min. I'm very optimistic about China. China has been a very flexible entrepreneurial country, and that's what I want to share with you. My first question is, given what's happening now in China, that It has been growing fast, rapidly during the past 40 years. Do you find any similarities with what was happening to Japan in the early 90s? Almost exactly the same path, and given the fact that China is also on the decline in terms of population. And this question is for any of you. And my second question is for Ada specifically, because in the last quarter, most economists and also including Fed, that the rate cutting is suspended due to inflation is under control. But in this first January, it looks like there are different kind of speculations about interest rates. Some economists say there might be a hike again because the economy is so hot, and so I want to hear your opinion as well. Thank you.
Okay, so why don't I start with that question, and then I'll turn it over to any of you to answer the other one. So it is our view that rates will only come down from here, that we have reached peak rates, that we're likely to start seeing the Fed cut the rates before the first half of this year. The reasons are twofold. One, we are seeing inflation coming down. We do think we're going to hit that 2.5% target by the end of this year. And secondly, we're seeing very strong prospects of corporate earnings growth in the second half of this year. So all of these things bode very well for investors. And actually, it's interesting because over this last year, we've seen such shifts, right? We've seen a shift to longer dated fixed income to capture some of those higher returns for longer. We've seen a big allocation to private equity and alternative investments for suitable investors, right? Because you're going to capture a lot of those market dislocations in the private equity space. And we are rotating our clients right now back to equities, because even though the market returned 25% last year, it was driven by 7 tech stocks. So there are 493 other names with a lot of value, and it's in the small and mid-cap growth area, and it's in 3 industries that we like a lot: the AI, cyber, tech side, the healthcare side, a lot of drug discovery, a lot of innovation happening there, and clean energy. Okay, so I think now is a very interesting time for investors. It's an inflection point. You have to get invested. You're going to miss it in the second half, and we don't think that there will be any more rate hikes. There'll be a rate cut before the first half of this year.
Thank you.
Anyone to answer the first question about? Take a shot at it. So to your first question, I think China is at a point, when you see the population declining, there's definitely similarity to a mature economy, right? In Singapore, in Japan, in Europe, you see the same kind of curve. But I think that this is the point of time whether or not China can transform itself. Besides all the technology restriction we have been talking about, I think let's look at China's system. There's one very important factor, that's currency. And China at this point still has a very much controlled currency environment. Not long ago, just a few years back, China started internationalize its currency, right? Very small offshore volume, but it's out there. They're testing the water. I always felt that the way China can control the currency is a way to keep the economy sort of in a bubble. And that gives the government some power to work with the problems within a controlled environment. And sometimes I really don't like about it because my clients really hate that. But sometimes I think, as a nation, when it's in the progress of, going forward, this controlled environment might be beneficial. So I'm curious as to, in this, because China has been actually decreasing the rates, right? U.S. is bumping up the rates. So I'm curious, whether or not this strategy could give China a break, a couple more years to work out their own problem. So I see, at least I know Japan went through, deflation for a long time, and then population decline and all that. I don't know China will necessarily have a deflation problem. I think right now inflation is going up and up. But I think the government is using their current environment to get themselves a few years to work out the problem. Now, whether or not there is a clear path forward, it's yet to be seen.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, the girl with long hair.
Thank you so much for hosting this panel. Definitely very insightful. I think one thing I want to circle back and ask a question is we talked a lot about raising confidence more from like a foreign investor perspective. I'm very curious about the domestic confidence that China is going to have to raise because they're very interrelated. And my question on that is, I feel like I think in early February, China central bank tried to cut RRR ratio, which was theoretically going to inject 140 billion liquidity into the market. However, we've been seeing very low borrowing from the Chinese business community. So I'm curious, I think there are policies coming out, but I don't think there's a strong rebound from the domestic market. And I think with the high youth unemployment rate, I think this also has something to do with the culture right now. There's a very popular phrase like 躺平, which means like you're just too stressed out and you don't want to actually go to work. So I think there are so many factors involved from the domestic side, and I'm curious about your thoughts how the Chinese government can reverse that.
Maybe just a quick word on it. I think the what you just cited right now about lowering rates and maybe policy instruments not having the same effectiveness that they used to is a really important one. That one of the challenges that you face in a low confidence environment is that even if lending rates are lower, there's more liquidity in the economy. If you don't want to invest because you're not confident about what your investment's going to give you back, you're not going to borrow. And so I think you've raised that point perfectly. And I think the point you raised about the challenges for foreign companies versus private companies is an important one as well, because most of our clients are American, some European. So we're sort of thinking about things from their perspective. But many of the policies that we think about, like making downsizing the state sector, making it a more level playing field for them versus these SOE behemoths, is as good for private sector companies as it is for foreign companies. And so I think we're looking for, when we talk about confidence building measures, like systemic reforms across the economy to deal with those issues.
The last question.
Yeah, thank you guys all for being here. We've talked a lot about how American and foreign companies are kind of in a wait and see position with regards to investing in China and continuing relations in China. But I was wondering from the Chinese perspective, is that the same for Chinese businesses and investors coming to the US? And for example, this past Super Bowl, I believe it was Temu or Shein bought a commercial slot. So there seems to be, at least for them, interest in coming to the US. And I was wondering if that's just an outlier or what your guys' thoughts are on that. So thank you.
So I can tell you that I started working initially on Chinese clients' globalization in 2006. And EY has a global so-called China Outbound Investment Network, and our total global revenue from these clients has gone, like 20% growth every year, gradually. So, and I think this question relates also to what the earlier question. If Chinese companies, private sector companies, can have a foot, a play in the global market, let's not look at Chinese companies only have to work on China market. If they can have a playground that is globalized, then that gives them a more diversified portfolio to survive this current challenging period. So I would say that what you see is not a coincidence, is not one-time event. I think there are more out there. So.
Okay, so that's it for today's discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.